Thank you, everybody, for your presentations. Very exciting. Now is the fun part, where we start having a conversation about what was discussed and answering the audience's questions. We do have a couple questions that came through here on the iPad. Again, if you would prefer to, you're welcome to stand up and ask your questions at the microphones. I'll open up with a question of my own. Alex, I saw there towards the end of your presentation some information in regards to the age of legislation. Can you expand a little bit on where we are in regards to legislation that would impact autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, sure. And I'll just preface this by saying, of course, I'm speaking from the perspective of an autonomous people mover, passenger transportation. But the nice slide I had up there was a picture of LBJ signing into law the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, establishing that, which is in effect what we go off of today, right? Contemplated for personal vehicles and traditional drivered vehicles. We operate by exception generally today because that's the only outlet to put pilots on the road. Now, in order to change those FMVSS laws, you got to go further back to President Truman, who put in place the Administrative Procedures Act to administer rulemakings and changes to the Federal Register and the rulemakings for NHTSA and other agencies. So it's kind of a makeshift process right now. All of our pilots are closely monitored by NHTSA within DOT and authorized by NHTSA. But they're through a process that wasn't designed for fleet scale autonomous vehicle deployments. They were designed for like bringing in your very cool vintage car from Europe to show up at a trade show like this, right? So what we are hoping that the federal government will do is show some leadership in the interim and reform some of these processes through authorizations they have in place today to streamline and modernize some of the approval paths to market here, because that's something that we've seen in the market. We are a service provider. We're not a vehicle manufacturer, so we rely heavily on partners. And right now, the U.S. market for OEM and autonomous vehicles, you look at what Europe's doing. The UK just passed their law. China, does whatever it wants. And so if you're an OEM looking to figure out where you're going to manufacture your next generation technology, it's tough to come to America and say, hey, here's our sales pitch. Please invest money here, hundreds of millions of dollars. We can't guarantee you're going to sell your vehicle. We can't even guarantee you'll be able to operate it. But, let's just cross our fingers and hope for the best. That doesn't really work in attracting high-skilled jobs and investments and capital to the U.S. So hopefully in the next, before the end of this year, hopefully NHTSA will put out a rulemaking or propose a rulemaking that streamlines this process and makes it more governable. And then ultimately Congress is going to have to pass some self-driving legislation like other countries have done to move towards more of a type approval to where you've got a punch list of items. Here are the performance standards you need to meet, and here's your approval to operate.
Maybe expand on that a little bit, and I, of course, invite everybody else to answer as well. What do we need to do in order to get legislators and the average road user accustomed or to appreciate the added safety of autonomous operations so that we can kind of speed the adoption or at least get legislation to change more quickly?
I think that was to me, right?
Anybody on the panel who might
jump in. I would say one thing that has been really useful for us is illuminating the different and very diverse use cases for autonomous mobility. People think, okay, autonomous vehicle comes to my door, picks me up, and takes me to my restaurant and back or whatever. It's so much broader than that in terms of freight, logistics. Bob made a really great point about you hit on worker safety and for us, quality of life for vehicle operators, right? They have a very difficult time with getting on-time performance in heavily congested areas. And rather than getting dinged for that or not being able to take a break, you could infill that with autonomous shuttles. It doesn't mean the operator loses a job. It means you have better, more frequent service and a higher quality of life for the operators that make the transit service possible. So having those kind of conversations and being able to point to pilots and case studies where you've actually proved out that concept has been very useful.
I think you're on. It's open.
Yeah, I think from the commercial vehicle side, it's all about building trust, right? It's making sure that we're engaging early, that we're providing that transparency, whether it's at the state or the federal level, whether it's with first responders, other road users. I think that's our obligation as an industry to build that trust. But we have to do it with data. We have to do it with real examples and not just hand wave it, but actually provide real material there behind it. So,
and maybe add also, it's really important that we as the industry, whether it's the OEM, Tier 1 or tech companies, work really, really close with the governments and the traffic regulation institutions. So I think that role is critical for us to create the confidence and also the conversation, the communication with those who take the decisions, but also those who actually use the technology and are affected by it just being part of the daily road. I think that's one. And then the second point is having the experience operating in the US and Europe. That's also really important to understand that there are really regional differences. So I'm based out of Munich, so I'm more on the European side, but in the US, it's quite different, right? So just culturally in Europe, it takes longer for safety regulations to be clearly defined, but you can't do anything if there is not really a rule established. So you wait, it's a bit more, a very step-by-step approach, right? And I think in the US, it's a bit more of a submissive system. So if there is no rule that doesn't say you can't do it, you go out and do it. So I think there is no, this is better or worse. It's just important to understand that there are different approaches to regulatory and to, in any case, work very closely with those institutions that help shape those regulations and standards for such.
Do you see in Europe that the road users and the public are much more comfortable with the autonomous vehicle adoption? I feel like from a marketing perspective, when I mention autonomous anything to somebody who's not in our industry, they're immediately terrified, especially when you're mentioning something about heavy commercial trucks being on the road and operating human out.
I would say yes. I mean, I grew up in Europe and I understand the culture quite well. It's a little bit more conservative, highly safety cautious. I'm not saying that it's not the case in the US, but very much regulation driven. Is this really safe? It starts also with data sharing, right? Even that part, is it allowed? And then you have the GDPR, like European regulated data rules of what you can and cannot do. So there's a lot more rules and let's say obstacles to be overcome. So it takes more effort, but it's possible. It just takes a little bit more time. And then, of course, within Europe, you also have the 28 member states. Every country has different regulations as well. They are trying to come up with a European framework, but that's still in the mix, at least for level 4.
And Bob, obviously the data you shared and the injuries and things like that, is there things that you see in what you're doing that's really helping to show the public and other road users the advantages of utilizing autonomy?
So really what it comes down to is those case studies are the window to get the California administration, that's proof that they're actually interested in it. They are leery. The state government, we have the legislature, we also have the Department of Motor Vehicles that we work in partnership with. So they get to see all the case studies that we do. So yeah, it's really important to know that, the all the way from the governor's office down supports the technology. They just want to make sure that it's ready to be deployed because, and I think these case studies are going to help do that. So that's why we picked certain aspects of that technology to show them that, hey, it will work in these specific locations and these specific jobs, because that's where we're going to start getting those little quick wins, right? California's been kind of an innovative state over the years, and so I think that we're still on that track to do the same thing with this technology.
If I may add one point, because we also have our driver-in semi-autonomous solution where we've been piloting over the last years with fleet customers in the US, now also starting in Europe. And I think if you show also the customers it's a step-by-step approach, you still have a safety driver in. The driver gets comfortable with such technology. So there's certain use cases that are automated, right? But he's still in. So he gives the sign, okay, I want to do a lane change. And then the system basically sees, okay, now this is a traffic situation, car coming from behind, but it's still measured to be safe. And then the system basically does the lane change or merge handling. So it's an incremental way to learn without taking the driver completely out. And depending on where you are, this is maybe also a way to gain trust from drivers, that they get the experience first before it's this disruptive, okay, you have a driver in and all of a sudden the driver is out. So that's maybe also a way to share those learnings and let people who have a truck driver's license just experience and drive it.
I think it's a matter of sometimes we see the bad news when you see something that went wrong and it gets a lot of publicity, but there's less publicity about the number of lives probably impacted and saved and accidents prevented by the utilization of autonomous vehicles. I'll stop hogging all the questions here and go to some of the audience questions here. So this one's for Andrew. To Andrew, between Torque and Daimler, how do you manage the risk of deploying prototype vehicles in commercial applications during the pilot phase?
Yeah, so a critical point in the pilot phase, we are always driver in, right? So we truly believe to get to that stage of driver out, there is a bar that needs to be met. That's all the way down from the redundant chassis, all the way through the software, and through kind of all of the operational aspects. And so our pilots today are done with a safety driver in, who we think are some of the best drivers on the planet, right? So these are highly trained CDL drivers. They know the systems inside and out. And so we balance that risk by putting a highly qualified driver behind the wheel. Ultimately, that will move to a progression of driver out, and we have really strict milestones, both on a performance and a safety side, to get us there. The key point, and the best way I always describe that risk, right, is we would never take that driver out if we wouldn't put ourselves or our families next to that vehicle going down the road, right? That's the bar. And so when we think about that progression, that's the level of trust that we need every road user to have. And so as we test in pilots, very much managing that risk with a safety driver, but as we progress towards driver out, again, key milestones to get us there.
Maybe expand on that a little bit. And another question of my own is the environments that you're operating in different weather situations. How is that impacting pilot programs, and how are you achieving those levels of autonomy? Bob and I were discussing, how do you operate a vehicle in the snow when you're relying on cameras to see lane lines and markings and determine position?
Yeah, so, if you look where we're running, most of our operations are in the Southwest today, but that does get weather. It gets high wind, it gets rain, it gets snow. And one of the key points to that is a commercial vehicle shouldn't operate in all weather conditions, right? We always say we want the vehicle to drive like the best CDL driver on their best day after their best night of sleep and best cup of coffee. And it turns out that driver wouldn't drive in heavy snow. They shouldn't, right? Blinding rain, you pull the truck over. And so I think one of the key points to think about from a deployment is we always want to operate like that best driver, and that best driver doesn't always keep going down the road. And that's something really, really important for people to grasp, is it's not covering everything, on day one. It has a strict set of things they can accomplish and do that safely. And so that's kind of the bounds we put there. Probably similar.
Yeah, very, very similar. Nothing more to add. And I think there's different ways how you can approach how to manage that. Because we have our, let's say, driver-in system in commercial operations, it is exposed to different weather conditions, but that's a different story for Level 4. Nevertheless, we do, of course, expose the system to different weather conditions and test what are the boundaries, what is still a safe state to do that. And so in our system, we have something called the ODD checker. So we have very clearly defined ODDs where we say, okay, it is safe to operate, so the system is engaged. But once the vehicle gets into an ODD that is not supported, then the ODD checker recognizes that and automatically the system is not engaged, and then the driver has to carry over in the phase where you still have a safety driver. And then that's how we really navigate also the risks, right, that you have with those semi-autonomous or autonomous vehicles on the road when they're testing.
Another question here for the panel. I believe this is, how do we close the gap between AV technologies and current infrastructure that the AV vehicles use? Obviously, we see infrastructure as very difficult, especially in autonomy when you're relying on the environment to tell you where to go.
Yeah, I think at least on our side, we have to work with the existing infrastructure, right? To think that all roads in North America are going to magically get repaved and smart lanes and all these other things isn't a realistic proposition. There's certainly opportunities to have some level of smart infrastructure, whether it's traffic lights or other things, but ultimately the truck itself has to be inherently safe going down the road. And so whether that's using, cutting edge AI to help determine ambiguous situations, or handling construction sites or other challenging things going down the road, the vehicle has to be able to handle those. And it can't rely on external sensors. It can't rely on really any external data, because at the end of the day, that vehicle needs to maintain its own safety going down the road. Would we like more infrastructure? Absolutely. And we'll take it and integrate it anytime we can get it. But trying to design a product today for infrastructure that doesn't exist is not a winning proposition.
Yeah, I would agree that the level 4 shouldn't rely on infrastructure only. It should really be able to operate safely on its own. Nevertheless, I think infrastructure can help support the AD technology in terms of safety, building in additional redundancies via the infrastructure. And I think it can also help increase the productivity if you, as an infrastructure provider, can track all the data that's going on in the traffic, and then you're able to feed that traffic information to the interface of the AD system, so that the more data you have, the faster you can basically predict things or maneuver the vehicle, right? So I think it's more of an enhancement where it can really assist the AD deployment, which is why we are going on this journey, working with infrastructure providers who are thinking very progressively, thinking ahead. How do I need to change my infrastructure to be smarter, and how can I help those autonomous OEMs or fleet providers to have a road that really does it safely and also productively? It's, of course, early stage explorations that shouldn't impact the commercialization per se, but I think it's a very strong proposition to understand how it can increase efficiency and safety.
Alex, is there anything in regards to legislation that would impact infrastructure or efforts to improve infrastructure to support autonomous driving?
In the last appropriations bill, there was a pretty important line item supporting the work of a new office within NHTSA for the Office of Automation Safety, which will be tasked with hiring new people and leveraging the new resources to work on these rulemakings and exemptions and approvals. So that's positive. The other thing I would note about existing infrastructure is also the human infrastructure, right? If you want 25, 50 multi-passenger shuttles in your area to close connectivity gaps and reach underserved areas, good luck finding 25 to 50 new drivers and operators and dispatchers and maintenance tech and vehicle techs and that sort of thing to fill that network. That said, we are a big believer in supervision of autonomy, supervised autonomy. There's this idea that, sort of a public perception will put tons of all kinds of autonomous vehicles on the road, and it'll be like that Maximum Overdrive movie where they're just all operating independently with no supervision. That's not going to work. You got to have human in a loop in these deployments. You've got to have human supervision to make sure that the vehicles they'll operate predictably as you can possibly want them to operate. But again, to Andrew's point, there will always be new and exciting obstacles and challenges on our actual roadways. And so it's just really important as we move forward, feeling confident that there's going to be human in the loop supervision over these networks that are deployed.
Bob, is there any infrastructure challenges you see at Caltrans or?
So yeah, the big infrastructure challenge for us is the wear items, the markings on the roads, right? It's Interstate 80 is a major thoroughfare through California over the Sierras. We put striping on that road 4 times a year. And when it snows and the chains from the vehicles, it wears. But I do think there's opportunities to concentrate on traffic signals and things like that to where the vehicle can speak to it. So we actually have another case study doing that right now too.
Well, that's a great transition there. We got a question here that asking you to please talk more about the case studies and creating autonomous lanes for autonomous vehicles, such as the carpool or protected toll lanes on Caltrans freeways. Who's doing the case studies, and what is the roadmap?
So, talking more on the case studies, right now it's the technology. We have to get that proven first to where we feel confident that it's going to be out there on the road and it's going to be safe. I think the autonomous vehicle lane is going to be way down the road. And I really hope that the technology is going to be able to blend with the vehicles out there that are already there And then at some point, there won't be a need for a lane. It'll be all the HOV is probably still going to stay because it's multi-passenger, right? But the rest of the lanes, when you're saturated with more of the technology, there'll be no need for it because the vehicles react accordingly. That's what I'm seeing through the case studies now.
And another question for you: are Caltrans autonomous vehicles currently with or without safety drivers?
They're with safety drivers.
Let's see. There was a question on here asking when we saw the potential for commercial deployment of autonomous vehicles. I don't see the question on here now, but do we have some indication of when we see more of a commercial deployment of autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, I'd say from the torque side, 2027 is where we see that initial scale up kicking in. And then I think really seeing it grow and grow out to 2030 and beyond. And that's based on, I'll say, a well-informed view of what it's going to take to get to that point, what it means, again, all the way from the chassis all the way to the software.
Yeah, I think our view is aligned with Andrew's, and our roadmap is, of course, always aligned with our OEM roadmap, right? So without mentioning a direct year, but I think it's in the time frame that Andrew mentioned. But it, again, really depends on the vehicle readiness, on the safety case validations, when will that be ready, right? And then also the customer acceptance. But I think in that time frame, and then, like I mentioned in the presentation, until it really scales up, that will take time, because to expand the routes and the ODDs, that requires continuous testing. So that's, I think, a really interesting question as an industry to solve or answer, right? How fast do you want to accelerate sort of the expansion widely, or how do you want to focus maybe just deepening specific ODDs that you have been piloting on? So those are the kinds of conversations we are currently having with our partners.
Next question, can you talk more about the impact of on insurance and the deployment of autonomous trucks? Last year, there were a lot of questions about insurance when I was moderating another autonomous panel.
So I think on the insurance side, we're exploring it. I think it's still quite of an untouched area. There is no specific direction, because I think the insurance model also really depends on what is the go-to-market and the business model of the autonomous solution in the future. Who is the customer? Who will operate? Who will own the truck? I think all of these questions are currently being figured out, but I would say the insurance part is a very critical part, because it's one of the most critical cost drivers. And that's why when we think about the commercialization path, of course, we will look into the different insurance models that would also help make it a viable business model for all the transportation stakeholders.
Yeah, from our view, and we've spent quite a bit of time not only with insurance companies and brokers, but also the fleets, and understanding where that value is. Look, we know there's huge value to unlock there, right? Autonomous vehicles have that promise for more safety, but even better data around that safety. And ultimately, it is a data-driven business. And so, candidly, we know what the insurance companies are looking for from a data perspective. We know what that's going to take to get them there. And then working very closely with the fleets is what's that TCO benefit that could ultimately be unlocked with insurance. And so that's something we're very, very close to. Because it is a key part of the actual go-to-market offering, right? Without insurance, there won't be a truck on the road. And so not only do we need that insurance, we want to do it in such a way that it unlocks more value for the fleets.
With that comment, we know that there's a lot of restrictions on drivers and the hours they can operate, especially in heavy commercial truck. As we get higher and higher levels of autonomy and that driver's doing less and less, is there any anticipation of that restriction on drivers' hours changing?
So I'll say from our view, we don't have a product until there's a driver out, right? So ultimately, we're not in that in-between space. For us, it's testing and piloting, driver out launch, to unlock that greater utilization of the asset. So we test very conservatively, but ultimately you're getting to a driver out situation.
No, this is definitely a question we've been looking into also with OEM partners who had the question, does it make sense to have a level 3 type of application, right? So I think there's pros and cons for it. If you could basically extend the driver's hours, then it could be actually a viable path. But so far it's more in discussions by regulatories. It's not really clear in terms of implementation in sight. And that's why I think it might take some time until it gets to that point.
Andrew, I suspect you have a lot of friends who are truck drivers, huh?
We do actually. Our truck drivers are the tip of the spear when it comes to software development for us. So they're the ones out there on the road every day feeding how we train our systems, how we operate. And like I said, when I say we want to drive like the best truck drivers, it's because we have them on staff.
Yeah, another fun fact about me, I actually have my CDL, so I can drive a Class 8 truck with trailer. So I know it's not easy. And as a marketing guy, I'm not doing it every day. So I get in there and try and get a 53-foot trailer through some tight spots and realize I'm glad I don't have to do this every day.
But I think that's a really critical point, right? Having those drivers who are a continuous feedback loop to your software development. Because if you want your software to be the best driver, you want to make sure you also have the best-in-class drivers available. It's actually not so easy, from what I hear from our operations team, to find those who are super good in driving, but also open to new technologies and willing to try that. Right? So you have skeptical drivers, you have drivers who are very interested, but without that driver's feedback, I think it's very difficult to develop a driver that can basically augment today's human driver. So the driver is a very critical element in the product development.
Let's see. Another question. Are there government sanctions protecting companies adopting AV technologies to hopefully prevent a world of lawsuits?
Anybody want to take
Nobody wants to answer that one.
There's no lawyers on the stage.
Yeah, I suspect that there's no government agency currently looking to protect or mitigate any lawsuits against.
Not typically how U.S. legislation works.
I will add, though, that we've had a pretty positive experience working in collaboration with the U.S. DOT and states like California, and it helps to sort of take a step back and realize when maybe we're frustrated with the pace of deployment. We're all trying to do something that's never been done here before in the U.S. or anywhere for that matter at scale, and so we're all kind of developing this together. And so I just, want to give the government some credit, the state government and federal government, for being collaborative and understanding the value proposition of this technology and wanting to help us as an industry and the government and the people who will benefit from it get there.
Yeah, and I think certainly the commercial vehicle industry is no stranger to nuclear verdicts and very challenging lawsuits. And so autonomy is just a part of that equation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think also accountability is really key. If you're looking for transparency, you got to be accountable, right? If you want people to buy into what you're doing, you have to be accountable for what you're doing. And if you're accountable and you prove it, you're transparent and you showcase it, then you're going to have the adopters. The early adopters are going to come to you then. And I think, the state of California supports it. But I don't think the state of California is going to show any favors to anybody.
On to another topic. How does the L2 roadmap look with respect to availability of electronically controlled power steering on Class 8 trucks?
So, as mentioned, we are working on the next generation of ADAS systems, and together with our tier one partners, we are actually exploring, right, what is the customer interest and also the willingness to pay for such solution. I think in the end, it always comes down to the business case. Do the fleet customers, essentially that the OEMs are selling to, a business case to invest in such technology? I think in terms of the technology, as mentioned, it can really increase the performance, it can increase safety, it can help to also reduce accidents on the road. But I think it's this chicken and egg problem where you have to prove, well, how many accidents can you actually prevent, or how many drivers can you more retain by having such technology? So those are the things we are currently working out with our OEM partners, but actually also with our tier ones as well, who are looking to sell EPS systems into the market to really find that sweet spot in terms of the pricing, business case, and then essentially the take rate of those systems.
And then continuing on with the level 2, as we get into a lot of lane keeping, automatic emergency braking, ACC, is there a fear that drivers are going to kind of disengage from the driving operation and not be fully focused on the activity of driving as we're working through level 2 and not in full level 4 where the vehicle's operating itself?
I think that fear exists based on also today's experience, right? Where you have sometimes false positives or it gives you warning signals when it's not supposed to. But that's exactly where we want to basically bring improvements, lessening the false positives and really creating a level of confidence to the drivers that helps to increase the engagement of such systems. So we've tested basically with drivers and trucks on the road, sort of driving with traditional ADAS systems today and how often would they disengage versus how often do they disengage if they drive with our system, where it's about comfort. It's about, does it feel like a human would drive, right? So it's about the performance and the level of confidence the system can give. And that's where we really see an opportunity for sort of the level 2 plus technology. And that's, the plus really means performance, natural behavior, and reliability, right? So the goal is to increase the trust of the drivers and to ideally engage it as much as possible.
And I think inevitably, as you make the driving experience a little less, require the driver less, there's always going to be those people who choose to disengage from driving. But there has to be safeties. I know we have the touch-sensitive steering wheel, which can recognize when the driver's doesn't have his hands fully engaged for a period of time, and he'll receive a warning, hey, you need to re-engage. So we certainly have to develop systems that remind the driver that they have to be driving, and this is still part of the task.
I think the steering wheel is one good example that you mentioned, but another aspect that we make part of our system is also having an in-house developed driver monitoring system that basically tracks, right, if the eyes are engaged, if the driver is looking right or left for a specific amount of time, so that you get a reminder when you're supposed to engage the system again as a driver, because it's limited.
You go back to the EPS question. Seems we've got some clarification. The question was, when do you think electronic power steering will be ubiquitous? This is required for L2 or higher. What year do you think that will happen? And how do we break the chicken and egg loop?
I think that question in terms of the EPS roadmap, I need to take back and discuss with the actual EPS providers.
Good answer. One more question here. This one for Caltrans. Can Caltrans reference the university or agency that is doing the case study on autonomous driving? Also, one of the most dangerous driving conditions on Caltrans areas is bikes. Then there's a note. Toll lanes are not HOV and are protected carpool designated lanes, and if autonomous remove vehicles, so one would imagine a case study.
So, listen, all of ours are on a controlled environment right now. They're not operating on California's roadways. Part of that test environment does include pedestrians. It includes bicycles, animals, all the scenarios that it would encounter, a vehicle encounter would happen on the road. We're putting that in the live test. So our expectations is that we're going to have a case study report that's going to show the performance of that vehicle in those scenarios and how it performed, and we will share it back and say, it recognized a pedestrian 9 times out of 10, but in dark, rainy, cloudy, all the different scenarios are going to be going on. So it's not just driving down the road. It's driving through residential areas. It's driving at freeway speeds. It's in the dark, in the daytime, in the fog, different traffic signals, crosswalks, no crosswalks, no lines on the road. It's going to have a lot of test cases in that scenarios. Yeah.
All right, we're getting down to just a couple minutes left here. I have one for Beep. What has been Beep's strategy for successful pilot deployments and partnerships? We've heard a lot about partnerships here, so maybe everybody can close again, emphasizing the importance of partnerships in this autonomous development.
Yeah, I will certainly echo the absolute requirement for good quality partnerships, whether it's research universities, local colleges, the OEMs, the tech stack developers. It takes a village to make this work. And one of the other big pieces of this partnership for us is the human capital, the people that make transportation systems, passenger transportation systems work. We've got a really good opportunity for, in my opinion, a workforce development revolution here. I mean, you think about the autonomous vehicle. Autonomous vehicles don't necessarily mean humanless vehicles, right? There's still the supervision aspect. Someone's got to manufacture and assemble the vehicle. They've got to ship it. They've got to supervise it. They've got to commission it. They've got to orchestrate the routes. They've got to maintain the vehicle, because at the end of the day, it's still a vehicle. And so there's a huge opportunity, I think, to not only improve the quality of lives for riders and people that want to get around their communities sustainably and safely, without having to hop in their car for a 2-mile, 3-mile trip. But there's also a huge opportunity for workforce development and onshoring a lot of this supply chain development. And back to the point about sort of progress on the regulatory and legislative side, I mean, we are balancing the incrementalism, getting there one step at a time. And ultimately, there's a time cost to unnecessary delay, because as these supply chains ramp up elsewhere around the world, it'll be tougher and tougher to onshore those here. So that's why we've been pleased to work in sort of a collaborative regulatory environment where we're trying to maximize what we can do under the current regulations to prove out the next generation applications.
Fortunately, that brings us to the end, and I know it's lunchtime, so I'm sure everybody's excited to go grab lunch. A big round of applause for our panel. Really appreciate their participation today.